other is the image of God as a thief in the night, because it was so outrageous. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about light and my relationship with light, and it is a complex relationship because I grew up in Arizona where there was lots of light all the time, and my eyes are really sensitive to light. So when at age 18 I moved to Chicago, which has its share of, in my estimation, wonderful cloudy days, I loved it. My eyes were at rest. I also developed skin cancer. I'm fair. I grew up in Tucson at a time when we put baby oil and not sunscreen on. And so I also need to be careful about being in the light, something I discovered as an adult. And so, you know, the sun as light for me is something, I've always kind of liked cloudiness. I've always enjoyed darkness. I've always been comfortable. When I'm at home, I've always been someone who turns off lights. I tend to have one light on in my house at a time. And I'm comfortable with that. But then I moved to Vermont. No, you're not going to accept this. I moved to Vermont and I came to a house that had no power. And so I installed, it was off the grid, I installed a solar power system in my house. And because of that, because for 7 years I had no generator, I was totally reliant 12 months of the year on the light that came from the sun. This is very impressive. Because it meant that I used little kerosene lamps a lot during the winter time. It meant that I was really, really conscious about when my light was on. I had two circuits in my house, a DC circuit and an AC circuit. And because DC lights, LED lights, use almost no electricity. And so I had a little light above my bathtub, so I could read in the bathtub and not using power, above my, behind my bedside, and upstairs and downstairs in the hallways, you know. So I just became very conscious, and so I was really conscious of the light, and I wanted the light. Because the light gave me power. Even though it meant on really sunny days that the first thing I had to think about was vacuuming, whether I wanted to or not. It still was a good and joyful thing. Because frankly, the thing that was most linked in my mind to the power that I had was water. Because my water used electricity to pump it, I did not have a gravity-fed system, and so I needed light. So it's actually been good for me, I think, to have a more balanced view of light. So I still have sensitive eyes. I still, you know, struggle with really bright days. But I also now in my heart sing out when the sun comes out. Like right now, I'm thinking, yes, my batteries are being charged. And many of you, I've known people with SAD. I think it's called SAD. Where you have a hard time when the days get short. You know, I've known people like that. This is not my issue. But I understand because of my solar power how important light is. And so I like that image of God as light, Jesus as light, which we hear in the first two readings. Because I do think that there is this really positive association that we have, but it's not without its, I don't know if fear is the right word, but too bright light can be hard for anyone. You know, we certainly have heard other Hebrew scripture statements where you need to turn your back. You can't see. You can't stand before God. So there is that sort of tension in the image of light, God as light in the scriptures as well. The other image that we have today is the image of God as a thief in the night. You know, and this is like one of the many parables and images that Jesus gives us that I think are just really discombobulating and that are very hard to reckon with. Because when I think about thieves in the night, although I've never been burgled in Vermont, I lived in Chicago for 28 years, and trust me, my apartments or houses were broken into many times, and it's a horrible feeling. And frankly, the worst was the time when I was there. You know, it's a really horrible feeling. You feel violated. And then it gives in you, after that happens, fear. Fear. And kind of figured out. But I have noticed that the image of the fear of God is something that comes up in Scripture, particularly Hebrew Scripture, not infrequently. And every time I bring that up to someone, they say, oh, it's a different word, or it doesn't really mean that we're afraid of God. And I just think they're wrong. I think that that is a real thing. And for me, what the image of God as a thief in the night does is that it gives rise again to that image of the fear of God. And so I was thinking about, what is that fear about? I don't know the answer to this, but I have a couple of ideas. One of them is, I remember when I took care of my nephew in Chicago. He came to me when he was 16. He was in a very bad place. He is now in his late 30s, and he has told me that as far as he's concerned, I saved his life, because I took him out of what was not a good place for him. And I enrolled him in a school, I got therapy for him, and he really has done very well since then. So, but I remember once during my time with him, after he'd been with me about a year, when he, who was a middle child, became my only child, as a 16-year-old, and almost felt burdened by that, but also knew how beloved he was to me. Knew in my care of him and the things I did for him, how beloved he was to me. And I remember once in a conversation with him, getting the idea that he was afraid. And what he was afraid of was the loss of that love. And so when I think of the fear of God, that's one of the things that comes to my mind, is that the fear of God is the fear of losing God's love. Now, if you are a parent, you know how hard it is to stop loving your children. I'm not sure that I've actually ever heard a parent, I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but I have no personal experience of a parent saying that they don't love their children anymore. That doesn't mean they don't give them tough love, because I hear many stories of that. I consider that a good thing. But there is that I think it's hard, and I certainly don't think that God, as my parent, as my father, as my mother, is going to stop loving me, but that doesn't mean that I can't fear it, and it doesn't even mean that I shouldn't fear it. So that for me is some of what that image that Jesus gives about fear, about the thief in the night, something to be fearful of, is about. The other thing that comes to mind is when I was in college, I had a really good friend who was very well versed in children's literature, which I was not. My mother never read to me, so when I started going to the library, I didn't read children's books. I was in the adult section pretty quickly. But he once told me that there's a line in Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, and in it, what she says is that you only need courage if you have fear. You only need courage if you have fear. So that having fear is not a bad thing. I would say in most of our lives, a little bit of fear is a rather sensible thing. But the question is, what do you do with that feeling? In the same way, I think that that's the question for everything that we do. Feelings are, the question is, what do you do with them? And in the context of fear, I think that what we get from God is courage. Even if we are fearful of the loss of God's love, even if we are fearful of this thief coming in the night, what we can get from this God of light is courage. Courage to do the right thing. And we know in our hearts what that is. I was so moved today by the Hebrew scripture reading, because hearing about arms being turned into plowing shares and that notion of peace, something that I think has to fill all of us with such yearning, such yearning. We know that a life of peace is a good life. And the question is, can we have the courage to overcome the fears that interfere with that and try to strive for that? And this Advent season, I hope you'll give some thought to that image of light, that image of fear, and that image of God giving us the courage to do the things that are right.